Okay, I think I'm just going to start. Hello and welcome to this third webinar in a series of 5 that deals with EU regulations relevant to the textile industry. Obviously, this webinar will be held in English, and today we will learn more about waste legislation from Karina in Ohana Public Affairs. I just want to mention that we have 2 webinars left after this one. The 4th webinar is on the Ecodesign for Sustainable Product Regulation on the October 29th. And the 5th webinar is on a revision of textile labeling regulation on November the 12th. So we're looking forward to that as well. So before I introduce Karina on stage, I'm just going to quickly tell you about 2 upcoming webinars which will be in Norwegian, and you can sign up for those on our page. And most importantly, we have our conference on the 19th of November, and you can also see the conference or the program for the day on our web page. And just a little information about this webinar. It's being recorded, and please ensure that your microphone and camera are turned off. And Karina in Ohana Public Affairs will now give a presentation, and it will then be followed by a Q&A session. And you can either write your question in the chat or turn on your camera and microphone and ask your question directly. So now I give the floor to you, Karina. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's hope everything
works. I'm going to stop mine.
So I'm going to... You should be able to see the first slide. I hope everything is...
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. So as mentioned, thank you, Gru, for the introduction. My name is Karina. I'm a senior consultant at Ohana Public Affairs, and today I'm going to give you a webinar on navigating the current landscape of the EU waste legislation. And I'm going to just very briefly introduce to you Ohana, just in 2 sentences. We are a boutique consultancy based in Brussels. We focus on textile and apparel legislation in the aspect of sustainability. We have been working with many brands such as H&M Group, Hugo Boss, but also NGOs such as Sustainable Fashion Academy, Organic Cotton Accelerator, and more. So we are quite experienced in the area of textiles. And the agenda for today is that, firstly, my aim is to give you an overview of the EU waste legislation and help you understand the linkages between different files. It might be a little bit harder for you because I will be mentioning a few times one of the regulations that you will have a webinar on only next time, but it's always one or the other. If they're not joined, that's either me or my colleague has to mention that. So be patient also with me. I'll try my best to explain this to you. And regarding the agenda, so first we are going to deep dive into the political context. Then I will explain how EU is trying to take a better care of the waste. Then we are going to deep dive into the Waste Framework Directive, specifically into the extended producer responsibility. Afterwards, just very briefly, I'm going to mention how the EU is tackling the waste shipment or waste dumping. Lastly, I'm going to go into the end of waste criteria, and then we are going to deep dive into the Q&A. All right, so let's start with the political context. So I wanted to first help you understand how will the EU textile policies drive and impact the textile industry. It is really important to explain that we have seen a massive shift happening in the EU. So you might have heard of a Green Deal. This is a political commitment to become climate neutral by 2050 and ensuring that the EU can scale circularity across the supply chains. And it was, of course, a very big promise to be climate neutral by 2050. And, we have to think, okay, what does this actually mean for the textile industry? So we have heard of the textile strategy that was published almost 2 years ago now by the European Parliament. And this is the EU vision for textile industry by 2030. So this comes with the vision that all textiles will be sustainable by this time. This means that the clothes should last longer, they should be durable, recyclable, ideally made with recycled content. And it also looks for like it talks about sustainability of a product, but not only from the design perspective, but also from the aspect of human rights and taking care of these social aspects of the products. But of course, none of this can happen without some rules and guidance from the European Union. So hence we have more strict legislation, because textile strategy, it's just an idea. It's like a pathway forward. This is not a binding legal piece. The textile strategy kind of addresses certain issues and links them to various pieces of regulations or directives. And what is really important or also to mention is, you might have heard that now we are in the time of the new mandate of the European Commission. So it will be between 2025 and 2029. And this is quite interesting because firstly, we are going to enter into the implementation phase. What that means is a lot has been proposed in the previous mandate. So the previous commission has drafted a lot of pieces of legislation, but at the end, they have to enter into force, and everything will actually come under this new mandate. And under this new mandate, we will hear a lot about secondary legislation, so what we call here in Brussels delegated and implementing acts, which will further clarify some parts of the legislation that hasn't been clarified during the actual legislation. So that is a bit the political context. Maybe something also to keep in mind is we don't know yet how much textiles are on the agenda for the new mandate. The hearings for the commissioners will happen on the week of the 4th of November. We hope that this will give us a bit of an understanding whether textiles will be still one of these points that the European Commission has to tackle and regulate even more, or let's say it was already enough to kind of set up all these laws in the previous mandate, and now we just have to wait when everything is in place and see whether that works or not. So that is a bit the context. Then, as a part of the political context, I wanted to show you how we should move from this linear to circular textile sector to ensure that we can achieve this climate neutrality, to ensure that we can scale up circularity along the supply chain. And basically, the European Commission has understood, all right, we want to go from linear to circular economy, but we have certain challenges that we need to face. For example, we are talking about durable, sustainable products that have recycled content. Well, that's a great idea, but today in the EU, we have a problem that we don't have textile to textile recycling that is scaled up. We only have 1% of textile to textile recycling today. So the European Commission, of course, had to think about a tool that would help tackle this issue that could ensure this goal. And one of the tools to tackle that is the Waste Framework Directive. And I will deep dive into this in the later part of the presentation. Afterwards, the EU has also thought, all right, we are also talking about recycled content. We are talking about textile to textile recycling, but actually we also need feedstock to ensure that we can have this good quality recycled content. And then they quickly realized that today the majority of recycled content actually comes from PET bottles and fishnets. So the EU thought, okay, we have to stop this. This shouldn't be allowed anymore. We should really ensure that textile to textile recycling is actually textile to textile recycling. So the recycled content comes from another textile and not from PET bottles. And the tool to tackle that was Ecodesign Sustainable Products Regulation. And my colleague will talk about this more in the next webinar. And the last one is well, we want this circular economy, we want textile-to-textile recycling and recycled content, but we also need demand, because if there is no demand, there will be no investment in recycling. Hence, there is a talk, and it hasn't been decided yet under the EU legislation, to set up some targets for recycled content, and that would be done under ESPR. And also something that is still under discussions in the EU is whether the Waste Framework Directive should introduce targets for textile-to-textile recycling. So as you see, a lot of small challenges that we have to face to ensure that we can actually move to that circular economy. And just to match these, what I talk to you through. So for the Waste Framework Directive, the solution is the EPR for textile, and ensuring that we have preparation for recycling to scale up the technology, meaning that the garments are prepared, so the zippers are removed and everything is given to the recycler just to make his life easier. Then on the aspect of the feedstock, as I mentioned, potential ban on PET bottles. And then also as a part of the systemic change, we hope that by having this mandatory recycled content that could come in 2027, the brands will have to think about design of their products. So asking for this recycled content sometime, maybe even this year until 2027, because the design of the product does take some time. Okay, and the summary of this slide is really that this shift from linear to circular economy requires a fundamental systemic change. And keeping that in mind, the EU has already mentioned that as of January, the 1st of January 2025, we do need to have mandatory separate collection scheme in the EU. So we know that currently only 12% of textiles is collected in the EU, which is very little. And so this obligation on the consumers and on basically member states will mean that a consumer will have to put in a separate bin the garments and food in a separate bin, which is not the case today in many member states. And we already have some member states that have implemented that. For example, France is one of the leading countries in terms of separate collection, and also because they do have an EPR in place. So that is interesting to keep in mind. I know you're probably aware what extended producer responsibility is, but just as a quick reminder, the separate collection of textiles, in order to make sure that this is sponsored, we need to have the extended producer responsibility. So the producer has to take the responsibility for the garment following the polluter pays principle and contributing to that system that we have collection, sorting, and recycling in place. And talking about the separate collection that enters on the 1st of January 2025, some member states have already implemented the separate collection, and even more, they have already implemented their EPR systems. And I'm not going to deep dive into details, but just to give you an understanding, one of the national frontrunners in EPR is France. They have their EPR running already for some years. They have introduced targets for collection. I think one of the most ambitious targets is that they want 100% of textile collection by the end of 2025. Keep in mind that, for example, in the whole EU, it's only 12% at the moment. So it's very ambitious. They also have a producer responsibility organization. So it is a very much fully operating EPR system. It is almost the same situation in the Netherlands. It is not as, let's say, matured EPR because it was only put into place in July 2023. but they have also implemented very ambitious targets, mostly focusing not that much on collection, but on reuse and recycling to make sure we have this demand and that textile-to-textile recycling can actually scale up in the Netherlands. There are some small differences between the scope of the EPRs, and what is maybe interesting for you to note is in France, we only have one producer responsibility organization called Refashion. In the Netherlands, we already have two, meaning that in the Netherlands, there is no monopoly of the PROs. I'm not going to stop on this, but just so you know, also in July 2023, Hungary has implemented their EPR system. And this is an overview of currently operating PROs in Europe. So we have one in France, two in the Netherlands. There is one that has been created by brands and has been operating on a voluntary basis called Scrap in Spain. And then we have the one in Hungary, but this one operates in a different way because it's actually led by a private waste management company. So it differs a lot from the kind of usual EPRs that we know from France and the Netherlands. And I wanted to mention that because now we are going to move to purely EU legislation, so the Waste Framework Directive. But I wanted for you to keep in mind that some member states have already done some work and they will have to adjust based on what will come as the final legislation of the Waste Framework Directive. So the Waste Framework Directive has been published in July 2023, and it introduces the mandatory EPR system for textile. What is interesting to know is that because the Commission proposal has been put forward in July, that meant that all the member states that had been working on a national EPR, for example, Italy, for example, Spain, had to put it on hold. So until the EU legislation is done, they cannot propose a national legislation. And the reason is also that they will have to adapt to whatever comes as an outcome of this Waste Framework Directive. And maybe one more thing that I haven't mentioned is that Waste Framework Directive is an already existing piece of legislation. It is something that has been actually ongoing since 2008. And this one was a targeted revision that was meant to focus on textiles and food. So this directive actually encompasses two. But for the purpose of this webinar, we of course focus only on textiles. And here I actually have a question to the audience, question to Guru a bit. Does this have a potential impact on Norway? Have you heard that because of this EU legislation being currently developed, maybe your national development of EPR scheme has been also put on hold? I don't know, we can discuss this maybe just quickly now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We haven't really, I know that Norway is doing some work on EPR, and the Norwegian Environment Agency is looking at what parts of EPR in Norway they can start working on already. So they've already started, but I don't think it has any consequence for the actual parts of legislations that are being developed in the EU. So it's more looking at how they're going to get the data, for example, in order to be able to charge the producers and so on. So yeah. Other people in the room might have more information, and they can tell us more about that afterwards if they'd like to do that. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Then let's move into the scope, because that's something that you have mentioned, what you're looking into. So what should be the scope? So under the current Waste Framework Directive, the scope of producer means that it should follow the polluter pays principle. So the producer is the one that actually makes available the product on the market. Also, what is interesting is that at the moment, the micro enterprise is out of scope. And I wrote at the moment because Waste Framework Directive is an ongoing legislation. It will be only finalized most likely in January 2025. Hence, we don't know what will be the final outcome of the law. This is a quite controversial point, as apparently, even though microenterprises do not have a lot of quantities of products that they put on the market, they're 80% of all the producers of textiles in Europe. In terms of scope, it of course includes the used textiles, but also unsold goods. And the definition of an unsold good comes from the Ecodesign Sustainable Products Regulation. And in terms of what is the scope of the used textiles, it's, for example, consumer clothing, home textiles, footwear, bags. I also wrote here mattresses TBC. So that's also something that has been discussed to add mattresses into this EPR system, potentially under a separate EPR, but within this Waste Framework Directive. Afterwards, we have the EPR fees. So what this means, it's basically a producer has to pay a certain amount for making the product available on the market, and this money will go for the end of life of this product to the producer responsibility organization. What is a little bit unclear under the current law is where the fee should be paid. So our suggestion in general is that the fee should be paid in the member state where the product is most likely to become waste. So let's say I import the goods from, I don't know, Vietnam to the Netherlands, to the port, and then I distribute them to other member states, to actual distribution centers, let's say in Poland and Germany. And then when I make them available to the consumer or ship them to a consumer online, that is the moment of making it available. Because even though we don't know if the consumer will travel with the product or, decides to ship it or give it to a family member living abroad, we assume that because it was sold to that consumer in that member state, it is where the product is most likely to become waste. Currently, the definition of making available on the market is not very clear. It is one of the biggest points of the discussion under this during this legislative process. We see that the European Commission has proposed a solution of a union market, meaning whenever you make a product available in the EU, so in the union market, that is where you should pay the fee. But of course, this could lead to a situation where a lot of garments end up in one distribution center and one country is overpaid versus the other one doesn't get enough money. Hence, the suggestion is to pay the members the fee in the member states rather than the union market. But of course, this could cause some double payments in case you move the products from one country to another. Let's say H&M places 100 jackets in Spain. There is no summer there. You need to move 100 jackets to Poland. You would have to pay EPR again. Hence, I mentioned here that there is a need for a reimbursement mechanism to avoid double payment. So that is, but I would say if I have to summarize this point, the most important, let's ensure that the EPR fee is paid where the product is most likely to become waste. So EPR fee collection, this will be, as I mentioned in the previous slide, the money will be collected by the PRO, so the Producer Responsibility Organization. And we don't know yet what will be the basis for this fee. So most likely it will be weight. And what the European Parliament has proposed, where appropriate, quantity of the products concerned. So it could be both. Let's see whether it will be weight and quantity or weight and quantity where appropriate. But basically, that is the idea of this EPR. And it will be done most likely, depending on the PRO, either on a yearly or a monthly basis, usually every 3 months. That's how it is currently done in France and the Netherlands. Now, very quickly, I wanted to show you the overview of the EPR fees. So here I have presented 3 visions on the EPR fee, one coming from the European Commission, one coming from the European Parliament, and one coming from the European Council. Why did I decide to focus on this? This is quite interesting because each of the institutions has their own vision of building the infrastructure for textile waste management. We see that if we follow the logic of the council, meaning that the EPR fee should cover basically everything because they suggested a non-exhaustive list and a lot of things that the EPR should sponsor, that could lead to a situation where we actually don't sponsor anything. Because let's imagine per product we have €1 and we have to divide this €1 into, I don't know how many activities, 10. Then we don't sponsor anything at the end. Whereas if we would go with the logic of the European Commission, so we have 5 activities, we have €1 to split between 5, we can actually ensure that we have really good collection infrastructure, that the sorters are operating well, that we prepare the garments for reuse, that we can recycle them, and potentially with the money that is left, we also invest into research and development. So not sure what's happening in Norway, but our recommendation is let's try to focus on few things rather than cover everything at once and then at the end build nothing. Oh, and also here, just to go back, we don't know yet which option will be the final one. So again, TBC. One of the points that hasn't been mentioned under this this overview is the point for preparation for recycling. This is something that the European Commission doesn't mention. They just mention preparation for reuse and recycling. But we were a bit confused because recycling, that's an operation, normally something that recycler makes money with. Whereas preparation for recycling, that's something that the producer should cover, meaning preparing these garments or removing the zippers, removing the buttons, and giving them to the recycler in the best possible way. So we feel like it's a bit of a mistake or misunderstanding from the co-legislators. So we hope, and here in Brussels, the producers and recyclers have been advocating to change that point for preparation for recycling. And also, if this point is not clearly spelled out, we believe that it could cause some issues, meaning who pays for this. So yeah, maybe a suggestion for Norwegian EPR, do not forget about the preparation for recycling. It is very important to scale up the textile-to-textile recycling industry. Okay, yes, so that was my recommendation. Now, what about the secondhand garments? So as I told you, we are following the idea of the polluter pays principle. So even if you're a secondhand garment, what you would call like a seller, theoretically, you're still polluter because you place on the market some garments. Hence, the European Council has proposed that the member states where there is a high share of secondhand products might ask the PRO to require from the secondhand producer to pay a fee. Personally, I believe that this could be very harmful for circular business models and actually moving from virgin materials to more secondhand materials, because let's imagine that you are a platform selling secondhand items, most likely the margins are already quite low. If on top of that, you need to add €1 per product for a secondhand item, that could be a lot. And this could not only disincentivize circular business models, but also could lead simply to the fact that, certain people potentially would just not go for this and would rather order things from Shein or Temu. And we definitely want to avoid consumer moving into this ultra fast fashion world. So that is also something that I would recommend, is having a stepwise approach for now, leaving the secondhand out of the EPR system. And, if we see in the future that there is a very high amount of secondhand fees, that secondhand garments that do not have the money to be handled by waste handlers, then that's something to be reconsidered in the future. Okay, moving to the next point, I wanted to talk about eco-modulation. So this is a term that you might have heard or not. Eco-modulation, the most simple way of understanding this word is discount. So eco-modulation is getting a discount for your product. So here I prepared this small table, which shows you the linkages between the Waste Framework Directive and the Ecodesign Sustainable Products Regulation. So the Waste Framework Directive will ask the producers to pay the EPR fees. And these fees could be discounted, so eco-modulated, based on the future criteria related to eco-design requirements. So you will deep dive into this next time, but just to tell you, the Ecodesign Sustainable Products Regulation will define sustainable requirements for products. And one of them could be, for example, recycled content or recycling. And this would allow you to get a discount if you're a producer, if you have these sustainable requirements in your products. So looking into it in a more simpler way. So if you have a normal t-shirt, you pay a full fee. If you have a t-shirt that has a part of recycled content, you get a discount. Of course, depends on the design. The most likely ways to get a discount that we expect, but this is not 100% sure yet, that's why I put a little asterisk here, is recyclability of the product, recycled content, and durability. I also prepared a small overview of how this could look like in practice. So let's say that the ESPR defines that you have to have 5% recycled content per t-shirt, and that is your minimum requirement to sell the product. If you get to have 6% of recycled content in your product, so in your t-shirt, then you can ask for a discount. So instead of €2, you will pay €1.85. But if you want to be very ambitious and save even more money and invest into more sustainable products, you would ask your producer to include 20% of recycled content per t-shirt. And that would allow you, for example, to get a discount almost 50 cents per product. So this is maybe a little bit complicated now because you haven't heard about the Ecodesign Sustainable Products Regulation and what is that going to set up. And hopefully you will remember this for the next webinar that you will have. But just think about it as like ESPR will guide how the producers should get their discounts under the Waste Framework Directive. That's the easiest way to understand it. So there is also this other discussion that is very political that we are currently having in Brussels, is that the European Council has suggested that actually we should not only modulate, so give discounts, but also penalize the producers, not only on ESPR, so not only on these sustainable products requirement, but also on something called extrinsic durability. This is something that hasn't been defined yet. We don't have a definition of extrinsic durability as such. This comes very much as an inspiration from the potential law that has been discussed in France to tackle ultra-fast fashion brands such as Shein and Temu. The idea is that the producer would have to pay a higher fee if they sell more products. That's the most simplified version. What risks do we see is that at the moment, there's no scientific evidence that links the fact that by having more collections as a producer, the consumer is most likely to discard the clothes that they have in their closet. So the linkages that have been made by the French government and have been kind of transposed to the position of the European Council is because you see more products in the store, because you see more collections, because you get more emails being notified, new items, that means that most likely you will just take your clothes that you have in your closet, throw them away, go to the store, buy more, buy new. So we are a little bit concerned because you cannot really prove that today. It depends from consumer to consumer. And also one of the aspects that we see as a problematic thing is companies who would actually design these environmentally friendly products. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, let's say you have 20% of recycled content. Even though you want to get a discount, you might end up being penalized. Whereas if you're a brand, let's say like Shein, and you don't even try to put the eco-design into your products, you just get a penalty. So actually, it could mean that there's no need to bother for a company to introduce these sustainable measures, which is a little bit worrying. So that's on extrinsic durability. And we also don't know whether that's going to make it to the final text or not. Most likely, yes. We don't know in which version, what exactly it would say. But because it's a very political point, we expect that. Very quickly, what are my recommendations for the producers? So start thinking about the eco-design of your products. Focus on one criteria, because as you know, durability does not go in pair with recyclability. So focus on one and try to really make your products that way. And try to think also how you can go beyond ESPR minimum requirements, not only to be able to sell your product, but also to get some discounts. Then we have register for producers. So as a producer, you need to register to make sure that you can be tracked by the national registers where you sell your products. For that, we are expecting an implementing act from the institutions, so the secondary legislation, which would actually clarify how this registered would be linked between the countries. It is important to keep in mind that the companies will have to report to the producer responsibility organization on different things. For example, on the unsold goods, on the products made available on the market. And the reporting will be done in the same way that the producers will have to pay the fee. So at the beginning, when I was talking about the scope, I said that we might have to pay in weight and quantity, or weight and when needed quantity. That would be the same for the reporting, so that should go in line. Then we have the producer responsibility organization. The producer responsibility organization will have this role also of educating the consumers. So they will have to, of course, share all this information that the producer will share with them, so what I just mentioned, but also they will have to educate the consumer, for example, by telling them what sustainable options do they have if they want to buy a new dress. Maybe say having like a list of platforms where they can rent clothes. They should also help them understand where to get rid of their clothes, so where to put them when they no longer want them. They should also teach or make the consumer aware about the environment, human health, social human rights, and fast fashion practices. We are not sure how this is going to be done by the PROs, whether they're going to make some sort of a campaign or just having on their website some information about fast fashion brands. This is also a little bit unclear for now. I'm just running because I see the time. So I'm very sorry if I'm too quick. I hope I can answer all your questions in a bit. So then we have the role of social economy actors. It is very important to know that they will still have their role in the separate collection systems. So you will still see the Red Cross containers, you will not only have the PRO containers, but also the Red Cross or other social economy actors. They will also have to report to the PROs to make sure that we know what happens with the garments if they're not sold. So that's important, and most likely they will be allowed to be part of the producer responsibility organization, but that is also to be confirmed with the final text. Very briefly, the current proposal does not include any targets for producers, neither on waste prevention, neither on reuse, neither on recycling. So what I showed you on the national legislation, this European directive does not implement any targets. It has been mentioned that these targets should be added only in 2028 after we actually have this EPR in place and we know how this works. We know what doesn't work, whether the collection is working, whether we have feedstock, etc., etc. Guru, how are we on time? Because I still have the waste shipment and the end of waste criteria.
That's okay. You can go on for another 10 minutes, I guess, and then we'll just do a bit shorter Q&A at the end. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So waste shipment regulation, I think what is the most important to know is that this piece of legislation was also quite political, because you know that we have this huge problem of Europe dumping waste outside of the EU. So the idea was that there is one regulation that ensures some sort of stringent rules to ship waste, not only between the member states, but also between third countries, OECD, non-OECD, and also how the transit would look like. Just very briefly on the timeline. So this is a regulation that has been already published. So it enters into force on 21st of May, 2024, but it will only apply as of 2026. One of the points that I have highlighted here is the prohibition of exports of waste to non-OECD countries for recovery. And why am I mentioning this? This point is very key for production countries. So most of the textile production countries are non-OECD countries such as China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, etc. If you would want to have recycled content implemented in your product at the production stage, most likely you would be thinking of having a recycling facility in these countries, or alternatively, you would have one in Europe and you would ship either the pulp or whatever feedstock that you get out of the chemical recycling to these countries. So keep that in mind. I will talk about this a bit more about talking about end of waste criteria, but this specific point could have an impact on production countries and getting the recycled content into the production. So yeah, again, it is not possible to ship garments theoretically to the non-OECD countries unless they will apply to become pre-approved EU Commission list countries. This is an extremely complex procedure, meaning that a country like Bangladesh or Vietnam has to have a full application proving that they have a waste management process for the next years in place, that this country can be audited, and much more. So basically, these conditions are almost impossible to comply with today by these countries, just because they don't know. They don't know what they're doing with certain waste. They don't know how the waste management will look in 10 years. They don't have these plans. Also, they have to become part of this list until February 2025. If they don't, they have to reapply in 2028. So it's a little bit complicated. For Norway, it is still possible to ship the garments for recovery. But of course, the destination of the facility license have to have to like approve that. I don't know how much you ship to Norway, but I don't think you ship waste to Norway, but just, so it's still possible if it's for recovery and not for disposal. Unless, it's for disposal, but it is allowed and there is like a mutual agreement that you want to receive that. What is still possible is, of course, to ship waste to OECD countries. The big one for production of textiles is Turkey. However, you still need to follow the whole procedure of all the documents and administrative burdens, etc. So that is a little bit about the waste shipment. And why am I actually talking about this? It's because we also have something called end of waste criteria. And end of waste criteria are basically criteria that will decide when waste ceases to be waste. And at the moment, we don't have the EU level criteria. So each member state understands differently when waste ceases to be waste. For example, in one member state, if you do textile to textile recycling, the outcome of that will be considered waste. In another country, this could be considered a product. There is no unified ways of treating textile waste today. So the European Commission has started to work on that with their joint research center, and they decided to develop that more or less at the end of 2025. What is important is that they will set 2 sets of end of waste criteria for reuse and recycling. And end of 2025, Q1 2026, that's when we are expected the adoption. So now, what are these end of waste criteria for reuse and recycling? First, reuse. So as you can imagine, if you are a sorter, you sort your garments, and then you have, ripped jeans. Well, we don't know how to treat that. One would treat that as waste. The other one would say, no, it's a product. So the idea is that the JRC will have these very stringent rules on what should be considered, a deemed product for reuse. First of all, that would help us to avoid that we ship products that should be aimed for reuse to third countries. And secondly, that would also help us to make sure that we have high quality of reusable garments rather than, very poor quality. The second one is end of waste for recycling. So today it is proposed that the end of waste status is granted after the recycling operation. And why is this important is if you recycle textiles, and the outcome of textile to textile recycling today is pulp. Pulp is still considered waste because it can only stop being waste when it becomes a fiber. So if you remember what I told you about waste shipment, if you would want to ship the pulp, so the output of the textile to textile recycling, to have it fully transformed in Asia and having it spinned and put into the new product, that would not be possible. So that's a big point for discussion also here in the EU, because of course, maybe you have heard about Renewcell, which was a textile to textile recycling in Sweden. There was a lot of criticism that, it was a great initiative, but why do you have textile to textile recycler in Sweden and not somewhere in third country where the production happens? It's very hard to implement that into the product or to integrate it. It should be closer to where the products are produced. So it is a bit technical, but I think it's good to keep in mind if you look at the bigger picture. So, following this idea that we transition from linear to circular economy, we need recycled content. Okay, how do we get that? We need Waste Framework Directive to get the feedstock. But then if we have the recycling, where do we do that? In Europe, elsewhere? How do we make that profitable? And that links me finally to a conclusion. I have two slides. One is just to show you how all these things interact with each other. So I told you that ESPR mentions these sustainable requirements for products. The Waste Framework Directive allows you to get a discount for what you're doing if you're doing it beyond, and also helps us get the infrastructure for recycled content. End of waste criteria helps us understand whether we fall under this and we need to follow the waste shipment regulation or we don't. And then the waste shipment regulation, whether it allows us to ship something or not. So everything is interlinked because at the end of the day, to fulfill ESPR, you need recycled content and you need all these three things to work so you can have it in your product. But on the other hand, ESPR will actually create a demand for everything to happen. Lastly, the timeline. So how, do we look at this at the timeline? So, I don't know what happened here. Let me just open it all. So we expect the finalization of the Waste Framework Directive Q4. I'm quite realistic, Q1 2025. As of 1st of January 2025, we'll have this mandatory separate collection that I have mentioned and the adoption of the Waste Framework Directive. At the end of the year, we expect the end of waste criteria. Also, in 2026, the member state will have to transpose the legislation. As it is a directive, the countries will be given all this time to think how they understand this and how do they want to do it nationally. After they've transposed this, they will have 18 months to create their national EPR schemes to be implemented. This is quite late, Q3 2027. In 2026, we will have these sustainable product requirements defined under ESPR. So we will actually know how many % of recycled content is that you need to have in your product in order to sell it. And that would allow us to also know how the modulation in 2027 can happen. So that is it. I'm sorry that I was rushing through, but it's a lot of information and I really wanted to give you the high-level understanding, and hopefully you can have a look at the slides in more detail and calm. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Karina. That's a really good presentation and so much material to go through in a short amount of time. Really interesting. We've already got a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read those out to you and you can respond. Let me have a look. There's one here. Use of recycled content is beneficial for a reduced EPR fee, but what about other materials with reduced climate, environmental and social impact? Will that be beneficial as well?
So that is something that is most likely to come as well under ESPR. So indeed, this reduced climate, environmental, social impact. However, as this doesn't directly impact waste, what can I say? How the European Commission is looking into this is from the waste perspective. So, if your product is durable, that will make it least likely to be discarded. So you get a discount. You're using recycled content, so they say, so that means that you already went through this whole cycle, got something, also better for waste, less virgin material. Okay, good. Recyclability, easier to recycle, good. It doesn't necessarily mean that this might not come. The European Commission does not link it directly yet to waste. This might come. We just don't know. We will only know in 2026 or 2027. Definitely important, but they don't see it as a direct link, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks. Another question, what type of standardized method, such as EDP, PF, etc., will be used for calculating or proving in a trustworthy way, for example, 20% recycled content, or any other criteria like durability, CO2 emissions, usage of chemicals, and so on?
So please keep this question for my colleague who works on ESPR, because I don't work on that, so I'm not that much into this. She's the one covering all that. The only thing that I can say is the idea today for the proving of recycled content is the chain of custody. There's no any good way to prove the recycled content, unfortunately. And this would allow us only to know whether it's post-consumer, pre-consumer, post-industrial. And the chain of custody today is done by textile exchange. But please save this, save this question for my colleague Ranbei.
Okay, we'll remember that. Thanks. And then another question: how is the local suitability for reuse going to be assessed at the destination country? Is this suitability related to the condition of the garment or to its use value? Okay, so that relates to the end of waste criteria, and that's something to come with the JRC assessment. Today, how we know that the JRC is most likely going to look into this is a little bit in two ways. So you will still have like the qualities, so A, B, C most likely. And then afterwards, you will, at the sorters, you will actually have to follow some strict sorting requirements that we don't know yet. What would allow you to actually ship it to a different country? So let's say you want to ship it to Ghana, as you're mentioning. So no, you're not mentioning Ghana, but you're mentioning cultural and weather differences. The idea would be that the sorter, would not send a winter jacket to Ghana and would not, send maybe a mini skirt to, again, like some country maybe in Asia or Middle East. So the idea would be that it should be cultural and weather appropriate, but that will come with the JRC sorting criteria, and we do expect that, especially for shipment outside of the EU, it will be quite strict and look into these things, because we have heard that it has happened before that you ship not appropriate garments to some countries. Okay, great, thanks. Another question: will there be any incentives to control overproduction of textiles in the future? So the overproduction aspect. The overproduction aspect, well, let's see what happens with extrinsic durability. That's, of course, in a way, the incentive. But on the other hand, not scientifically based yet. So how could we maybe make that better? How could we help the legislators to find some middle ground, meaning looking into overproduction, but trying to have some sort of studies or scientific, reports that would help them assess what is that actually incentivizes that much overproduction. We also talk a lot about in the EU the fact that a lot is put on the producer. Of course, I'm not defending here the producer, but it's very little about customers' education. And we have to remember that consumer plays a huge role in this overproduction, because there is a demand. And it's a bit of this, chicken and egg situation. So what we've been also discussing here in Brussels is, will we have any sort of directive or regulation that would look also into the consumers' practices? Would there be anything that would help us educate them a little bit and maybe help them understand that you shouldn't go to Shein, and just look into the cheapest option that you found in the store, thinking that that's good and you're just saving money? It's a very, very tricky one. I don't have a good answer. I think it was a good answer. Thank you, Karina. So we've run out of time. It was really good, and you're getting so many compliments in the chats here. Thank you for a great presentation, and then I hope to see all of you on the 29th of October for the ESPR regulation webinar that we're doing. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And maybe, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. You can share my email. I'm happy to respond.
Fantastic.
And please keep one of the questions for Runway. Maybe save it for different.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.